Should I talk to Igor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what is the importance of demand, and why is it important in the context of economics and understanding the world?
All right, multiple questions. All right, so what's the importance of demand? The economy is what you get when consumers and producers interact. So consumers are people who have money and they're willing to exchange the money for goods and services. And producers are people who have goods and services and they're willing to exchange them for money. So when these two groups, the consumers and producers, come and they interact, what happens is an economy. So to go to the question, what's the importance of demand? The behavior of consumers is summarized, it's encapsulated in this phenomenon we call demand. So demand is a summary of all the things about consumers that cause consumers to do what they do. So it becomes a fundamental building block in describing the economy.
How is an understanding of demand, how does that enable us to make better choices for society?
All right, how does understanding demand help us make better choices for society? Yeah, this is a hard one. Because an economist would say, well, demand isn't about making choices for society. Rather, it's about describing the choices that people in society make. So it's more of a passive thing of saying, here are a bunch of people and they're behaving a certain way. How do we describe this? And demand helps us to describe this. Now, one of the things that we can do if we have a handle on demand is we can predict what will happen when certain events occur. For example, there's a hurricane and it shuts off people's electricity for an extended period. We know from what we understand of demand that demand for electrical generators will rise. And in turn, we know then that the price of electrical generators will rise as well, and there'll be more electrical generators that are purchased. All these sorts of things, how people react to events, we can predict if we understand demand.
What are the dangers of misunderstanding the relationship of demand and supply?
Yeah, so this is really important. If we misunderstand the nature of demand and supply, then we're destined to do things that actually end up making society worse off. For example, if I don't understand how demand and supply in a labor market work, my tendency might be to say something like, well, look, the way to help poor people is to impose a minimum wage, and by imposing minimum wage, now the firms are forced to pay their workers more, and this is good for the workers. If we understand demand and supply, we understand that that's actually not what happens. What happens is you end up helping some of the workers at the expense of other of the workers, and it turns out that the workers that are being hurt are the very workers that you actually want to help. So misunderstanding demand and supply from a policy perspective can cause us to enact policies that actually have the exact opposite effect of what we want.
Anthony, what's the impact of a price ceiling on the economy?
What's the impact of a price ceiling? So, under normal circumstances, you leave a market alone, and if people want more of a product than they did before, the price of the product goes up. And if it becomes easier to produce the product, maybe because price of materials fell or because a new technology comes along, it becomes easier to produce a product, the price of the product falls. So price, if you leave the market alone, is an indicator that kind of summarizes the combination of how hard is it to produce this good and how badly do people want it. One of the benefits of a price is it acts as a I want to say filtering mechanism. That's not the right word. It acts as a what is the word you look for when you dole out things to people? Rationing. It acts as a rationing device. So if the price of an electrical generator rises to $1,000, that's really expensive. What happens now is that the price rations the electrical generators. People who have an intense need for the thing will buy it. They'll be willing to pay. They won't be happy, but they'll be willing to pay $1,000. People who have less of an intense need won't. And so they'll step out of the market and say, it's too much for me. I don't want the electrical generator. I'll do without it, right? So what ends up happening in the misconception is, well, what happens here is that the rich people all get the electrical generators. That's actually not the case. What happens is the generators will tend to go to people like grocery store owners who stand to lose tens of thousands of dollars worth of meat and produce because the power has gone out for an extended period. Or it goes to the gas stations that have a tremendous amount of gas here that people need that they can't get out of the tanks in the ground because the pumps are electrically operated. So what ends up happening if you leave the market alone, the price will ration the product so the product goes to the people who need it most. Right? Does this mean that rich people aren't going to get generators? No, rich people probably will get generators. In fact, the rich people probably already have generators, right? They bought them ahead of time. But what happens is these generators go to the people who need them the most. So this goes to your question, what happens if you impose a price ceiling? So we say something like, look, this is wrong. Price of electrical generators normally are $300. We should not allow them to go to $1,000. We should keep them at $300. Okay? If you're going to do that, the number of electrical generators you have is still going to be rationed. But it's not going to be rationed by price. It's going to be rationed by something else. It's going to be rationed by who you know. So I happen to be friends with the guy who owns the store that sells the generators. And he looks around and he says, well, by law, I can't sell these things for $1,000, which I could easily get. I've got to sell them for $300. So if I've got to sell them for $300, they're all going to be gone by the afternoon. I might as well hold one back and give them to my friend Davies. So I end up getting one. The electrical generator was rationed to me, not because I have an intense need, but because I know the guy who's selling them. So either way, whether you leave the market price alone and let it rise to its level, or if you impose a price ceiling, in both cases, you're going to ration the product. The question is, do you want your rationing mechanism to send the product to the people who have the most intense need, or do you want your rationing mechanism to send the product to people who are well connected?
You talked quite a bit about optimal output. Why is this an important topic or concept for students to grasp?
So optimal output, when we say optimal output, there's two ways we can look at this. In the technical terms we use are profit maximizing output and efficient output. So profit maximizing output is optimal for the firm. This is the output level that maximizes my profit. Efficient output is the output level that is optimal for society. If the firm produces at its efficient output level, that means that its cost per unit is at its lowest point. Now you can hear those words and think, well, that's all good news for the firm, right? Its cost per unit is low. From society's perspective, it's also good news because cost per unit represents the value of the resources the firm is taking from society to produce its product. If we can get all the firms to have their cost per unit at the lowest possible point, at the efficient output level, then society as a whole is making the best possible use of its resources. We're getting the most amount of product out of our limited land and materials and energy. So from society's perspective, society would like the firms to produce at their efficient output level. From the firm's perspective, the firms want to produce at their profit maximizing output level. And this is where the joy of competition comes along. It turns out that the more competitive a market is, the more likely the profit max output and the efficient output are the same. So this is one of the reasons why economists get very excited about competition. Competition causes the firm's goal of profit maximization to be the same as society's goal for efficient output.
Anthony, if society never actually reaches equilibrium, then why is it an important concept for us to understand?
This is a great question, because we draw, in principles economics, we draw all these graphs and we say, here's demand, here's supply, here's equilibrium. And the students walk away with this idea that equilibrium is this dot on a board and this is where the market always is. It's not the case at all. In fact, it's probably the case that markets are at disequilibrium far, far more than they're at equilibrium. And so does that mean that equilibrium doesn't matter? No, it doesn't. What it means is that markets aren't these static things. When you draw demand and supply on a chalkboard, it's because the chalkboard isn't animated. You've got to draw demand, supply, here it is, right? But in fact, demand is constantly fluctuating. Supply is constantly fluctuating, which means the equilibrium is constantly fluctuating. But the equilibrium is like a piece of gravity that's always pulling us toward it. So as the equilibrium goes up, it pulls the price up, it pulls the quantity out. As the equilibrium comes down, it pushes the price down, it pushes the quantity in. So prices and quantities are constantly moving toward equilibrium.
If is so important for us to be able to understand the way the world works and to make good predictions about what to do next as individuals or even as governments. Why is it that so many economists disagree on so many things?
Well, you see, we have to go back to profit maximization, because the media is a profit maximizing entity, and they make profit from selling news, either through advertising or newspapers or whatever it is. And so how do they make money? They make money if they can get you to buy their news, and the way they get you to buy their news is to tell you controversial things or things that are not common, right? And this is all exciting. You'll buy the newspaper, you'll click on the ad or whatever it is. So what you'll see in the media is points at which economists disagree being given prime place, right? So anytime two economists disagree, this is what you see. What you won't hear reported largely are points on which economists are in agreement. And the points in which economists are in agreement far, far outnumber the points in which we're in disagreement. And the unfortunate thing here is that the media portrays the disagreements to the extent that people get the perception that economists disagree on everything. And so when an economist comes out and says something like, look, generally speaking, a minimum wage causes unemployment amongst the least educated, the least skilled workers. The vast majority of economists agree with that, but the non-economists will hear that statement and just assume that, well, economists must disagree about this because economists disagree about everything. But it's not because we disagree about everything, it's because that's what gets in the news.
What's the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics?
The difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Well, I'm going to be flippant first. Macroeconomics is microeconomics done poorly. Now, the serious answer. Microeconomics is economics focused on individuals, individual firms, individual people, or small groups of firms, small groups of people. And when we look at small groups of people or individual people and individual firms, we can describe these things in much more detail. Macroeconomics is looking at broad swaths of people, so the entire population or all firms. And when you look at the economy from that perspective, you can't describe each person, each firm in detail because there are hundreds of millions of them. So you'll get something that's just completely unwieldy to deal with. So in macroeconomics, what we do is we make some broad assumptions and we say, all right, let's assume for the sake of argument that everybody has the same preferences. You like beer and pizza as much as I like beer and pizza, and everybody else likes beer and pizza the same as we all do. And so on the one hand, it's unrealistic to say that. On the other hand, the differences in our preferences do kind of average out. So you get people who really like pizza and people who really hate pizza, and you get enough of these people, they kind of average out, and you get people who have like this average preference for pizza. So macroeconomics looks at the world like that, and it's the only way you can do it and talk about these large swaths of society, at least with our current technology. Someday we'll have computers and mathematics that are able to model each of the 300 million people in the United States individually. When you could do that, then you got something really cool. But the state of the art isn't there yet.
I'll always ask you like a very meta question.
Yeah.
About you personally. Why did you choose to dedicate your life to the study and teaching others of economics?
Why did I dedicate myself to studying and teaching economics? Kind of like the first answer is because my mother told me to. I was a senior in high school going on to college, and I didn't know what I wanted to study, and I liked mathematics, and my mother said, go study economics. It has lots of math. So I did, and I ended up loving the thing. And I was trained as most economists are trained, which is in the mathematical type of economics. We do lots of mathematical modeling and econometric work and all this stuff, this traditional economics. And so I'm doing all this stuff, and if you look at the data, I'm trained as an econometrician, right? And so if you look at the data, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, data everywhere kind of point to the benefits of a free market environment. The more free markets are, the better off people are. You get better social outcomes, you get better economic outcomes, you get better environmental outcomes. There are exceptions, but on average, that's what you get, right? So I'm looking at the world as standard economist does. And I came about, this was long after I'd finished my PhD, I encountered some economists at the Institute for Humane Studies. And these economists were trained in the Austrian view of economics, which is, I'm not an Austrian, right? But near as I can understand it, that's the exact opposite. They don't do any of the math, they don't do any of the statistics, they philosophize about economics. And I'm listening to these two friends who become good friends of mine, an economist, Howie Bacher, and a philosopher, Mark Labar, both talking about free markets. And they're saying the same things that I say as an econometrician, that generally speaking, these things work, and here's why. But they're not making empirical arguments or mathematical arguments, they're making philosophical arguments. I had never heard this before. You know, it's like someone coming and describing the laws of physics using colors instead of mathematics. It just completely blew my mind. And it was at that point I realized there must be something fundamentally true about this result I've come to, that I can come to it and they can come to it, the two of us using completely different tools. And so once I discovered that, I thought, this is great. This is something that needs to be told to other people. So I'm a professor.
Anthony, if people don't always act like utility maximizing machines, then how can economists use utility graphs?
Yeah, so if this is a common criticism of economics, that economics is based on the assumption that people are utility maximizers. They seek out what makes them happiest. And people argue that maybe that's not the case. Maybe people aren't utility maximizers. To which I respond, give me an example of someone who isn't a utility maximizer. And one example some of my students gave once was, well, there was this frat party, and at the frat party, this one guy had a bit too much to drink, and his friends dared him to put his head through the wall, and he did. And he made this hole in the wall. And the guy then subsequently has a headache and says, this is not a good idea. To which my students say, that's an example of someone not operating as a utility maximizer. To which I respond, no, he is operating as a utility maximizer. The problem is he had faulty information. At the time, he thought this would be a really cool thing to do. So in his head, as he's making an economic decision. Of course, he doesn't do this consciously, but what he does ends up being the same as if he had done this consciously, which is to weigh, on the one hand, the coolness of, I can put a hole in this wall using nothing but my head, against the cost of, this is going to hurt. And what happened was his faulty information was he misjudged how much it was going to hurt. So what he did, his behavior actually was utility maximizing. A priori, that is before the fact. After the fact, we can look at it and say that was a stupid thing to do. But you can only do that after the fact.
What is spontaneous order, and how is it important to understand economics?
Spontaneous order is the phenomenon of order emerging without any planning. Give you a very good example. The English language is an example of spontaneous order. There's nobody somewhere that laid down the rules of English language and said, every sentence has to contain a subject and a verb and a predicate or whatever it is, and this word means this particular thing. Now we do have English professors who will tell you, well, the rules of the English language are every sentence has a subject and a verb. But the English professors didn't design the rule. They're describing the rule that evolved. Similarly, you have dictionaries that give the definition of words. But the dictionary isn't saying this is now what the word means. The dictionary is telling you this is what people have come to accept that the word means. So the language itself is spontaneous order. Nobody designed the English language. It emerges. It emerges because we have a need to communicate. And we figure out through trial and error that if we make certain sounds, the two of us will understand what these sounds mean. And Igor comes along and he realizes we've got something good going on here, that we can make sounds and understand each other, and he has incentive to figure it out and to contribute to it, and the whole thing emerges. This is spontaneous order. The cool thing about economics is that an economy actually is a spontaneous order, and that's when it performs best, when you leave it alone to do what it does, which is spontaneously emerge. When you try and set rules on it to define this is what the economy must do, you tend to get bad outcomes. You get the same bad outcomes as, for example, the language Esperanto. Somebody somewhere decided, okay, this language stuff, emerging is just nonsense. What we need is some nice, well-crafted, clean language. And some smart people sat down, they made rules. And the rules for language was Esperanto. And nobody speaks the damn thing. And don't speak it in part because it's not an emergent process. It's not something that emerged because people wanted it. It's there because someone said, this must be so.
Should I major economics in college?
Should you major in economics? I tell my students the job in which they will spend most of their careers has not yet been invented. So what is best for students is not that they learn how to do something, but rather they learn how to think. The employer, and in some cases the employers don't exist yet, but when you get there, the employer will help you to figure out what it is you should be doing. What the employer needs is a raw material, and the raw material in human form is somebody who can think critically, who can analyze, who can communicate, and economics teaches all of these things. In part, this is why economics tends to be a little less popular than other courses, because it's not easy to do that, or at least it's not easy to get over the hump of not thinking critically to thinking critically. But once you make it over that hump, it's then easy to continue to do, and you become very valuable in the marketplace.
What is the knowledge problem and why is it important?
The knowledge problem is the problem that someone who is going to decide for us what the economy is going to do. So we're going to have what we call a central planner. The central planner is going to decide what car you drive, what price you pay for gas, how much gas you consume, all of that. We're going to have a centrally planned economy. The problem with a centrally planned economy is not that the guy in charge is bad or he's selfish or anything like that, which that might be the case, but it might be the case in a free economy also, right? People can be bad, people can be selfish. The problem in the centrally planned economy is that the guy who's making the decision doesn't have enough information to make the right decision. So the example I give my students is you've got to order lunch for people. And if I'm going to order lunch we've got 5 people in this room. I don't know what Igor had for breakfast and therefore what he might like for lunch. I don't know that Dan is allergic to wheat or whatever it is. I don't know that you had something versus something else. I don't know this stuff. So when I go out and order lunch, I'm going to get the order wrong, right? I might get something by accident that you like that you don't. This. Now you could say, well, Davies, just go ask the people, which I can do. I can ask you, what would you like for lunch? What would you like for lunch? What would you like for lunch? I can do that because there's 5 of us in the room. And the question is lunch. If you've got an economy of 300 million people, and the question is not just lunch, it's lunch today, lunch tomorrow, lunch the next day, plus breakfast, lunch, plus breakfast and dinner, plus what kind of car you're going to drive, where you're going to drive it, where you're going to live, what kind of gas you're going to put in it, how much gas you're going to put in it, you're going to take the bus or the train instead, or you're going to fly, what kind of clothes you're going to wear. You see the problem. The amount of information becomes just astronomical. So someone who's going to command the economy is going to make the wrong decisions, not because he's bad or stupid or anything else, but because it's just impossible to have the right amount of information to make those decisions.
Anthony, what's your favorite movie?
My favorite movie? I'm a huge Star Trek fan. So anything Star Trek, with the exception of Star Trek, like the original, the Star Trek, right? Kirk, Spock, that's Star Trek, right? Next Generation is not Star Trek. Although Voyager is a close second.
What's your favorite Star Trek movie?
My favorite Star Trek movie, I'm going to embarrass myself by telling you this because it's not like, the Shishi one, is Whales. Which is, I forget, like Star Trek 4 or something. Star Trek 4, yeah. Voyage Home. And the reason is because Star Trek was, the thing that was really cool about Star Trek, it did 2 things. It showed you this future that was hopeful. That in which we had solved the problems of poverty and all of this, and people were free to just go out and explore, right? But also it was very philosophical, talking about the nature of humans constantly. What is it to be human? What is it that makes us different or the same as the rest of creation? And more so, I believe, than any of the other movies, that one particular, The Whales, hits those things. And it hits it in the way the old Star Trek used to do from time to time, is a humorous thing, right? But it hits very hard at what is the nature of humans? What are we about? Once we get that right, we'll start to live with each other in a far better way than we have in the past.
Are there any economic concepts found in Star Trek?
Any economic concepts in Star Trek? Well, yeah, see, this is the problem as economists, because everybody who watches Star Trek who's a non-economist says, yeah, well, in Star Trek there's no money. We may reach a point. Should I say that? Maybe I could. I don't know if I could say that or not. I've often thought about what happens when we reach a point, which we may reach sooner than I had first thought when I first had this thought, in which you can get anything you want for free, right? So we've got these 3D printers now that can print stuff. right? So if I want something, my 3D printer can print it. Now it can't print a computer, but I could imagine 10 years from now it could. Right? There are scientists working on the printers actually printing food. Get that problem solved so that the printer can print anything you want. Also get the energy problem solved. So we've got clean fusion or whatever it is, you've got limitless energy. You now live in kind of a Star Trek world. Whatever you want, you can have. Now, does economics disappear at that point? No, it doesn't disappear. What happens is our constraint shifts. Right now, our constraint is I only have so much money to buy stuff, and I only have so much money because I'm only paid so much, and I'm only paid so much because the value of my labor is only this. Right? So all of that, going back to the value of my labor, is what constrains me. When you live in this Star Trek world in which you can have anything you want, your constraint now becomes one of time. I can't consume everything, right? I'm not going to live that long. So I have to choose. What do I consume right now? Do I consume this or do I consume that? And the laws of economics don't disappear. They're there in full force as they always are. It's just that your constraint is no longer one of money. It's one of time.
And where do we see time? Where do we see time as a constraint in classical economics? Would interest rates be one example of that?
I don't know. I guess maybe, yeah, interest rates are probably the prime place where you see the constraint of time, and we see it there. Somebody said recently, it was published in some science magazine, something about man's measuring time is what led to the evolution of interest rates, which is completely false. The argument the guy was making was if we had never invented clocks, we wouldn't have interest rates. It's not the case at all. Interest rates evolved because of the fact that we would rather have stuff now than later. Subjectively, each one of us has this concept of time. I would rather, if you're going to give me a Ferrari, I would rather you give it to me today than next year. Why? It's going to be the same exact Ferrari now versus then. Because a year from now, I'll be different. I may be in a situation where I can't enjoy it as much as I do now. I'd rather have it now. And that idea of we would rather have things now than later, on average, is probably the original time constraint in economics. And it's what gives rise to interest. The reason you've got to pay me $1.05 in a year's time in exchange for my loaning you $1 now is because I don't want to give you the $1 now. So you say, all right, you give it to me now, I'll give it to you back in a year and I'll give you $5 extra. You're paying that interest, what you're really doing is paying me for the fact that I want stuff now, not later.
What should we do when markets fail?
Good answer on Star Trek. I love Star Trek, not for me.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
See you guys all later.
What should we do when markets fail?
What should we do when markets fail? I think the question is, why has the market failed? If the market has failed, if you want to call it a market failure, we have to define what market failure means. I'll use it in the more general non-economic way. If the market has failed because, for example, we've had a hurricane come through and it's wiped out a bunch of stuff. And now there's no grocery stores, there's no food, there's no power, this. If that's the kind of failure you're looking to fix, the best way to fix it is to leave the market alone. The market will fix itself. And you might say, oh my God, but there are all these people, they're dying, they're starving, they need something. That's true. But intervening isn't going to fix that problem. You say, well, sure it's going to fix it because the government will come in, the government will do X. Well, you're waving the government like a magic wand. Just saying the government is going to come in and do X doesn't mean the government's actually going to come in or actually do X when it gets there. Right? The question is, what is the best way to fix ourselves after something bad has happened? The best way to fix ourselves is to make sure that every one of us has maximum freedom to act. The more freedom we have to act, the more able we are to make our own decisions about what's best for us, the people around us, our neighbors, our families, this. And together, we make society better. If you come in and say, as a central planner, okay, here's the government showing up, we're going to do the following. Almost invariably, you're going to get it wrong. You might make some people better off, but you're going to make a lot of people worse off. So the best way to solve market failures like that of a natural event is to leave it alone. The other type of market failure is the market failure that arises because we intervened in the market in the first place. So the classic case is the housing bubble and burst. And there are non-economists and some economists who look at that and say, well, this was actually, the housing burst in the market crash was a market failure, because what happened is we had a lot of banks go out there and make loans to people they had no business making loans to because they're greedy banks. And what happened is what you would expect. The people can't afford to pay off their loans, and so they go bankrupt, and the banks no longer have these assets of loans, and the banks go bankrupt, and the whole thing continues like that. In fact, many economists, myself included, would look at that and say, the problem wasn't the greedy banks. If you want to call them greedy banks, they were greedy banks before, and they were greedy banks after. That's not an explanation for what happened. What happened is the government intervened, and it took a loan, and a loan is two things. On the one hand, it's a plus for the bank because the bank gets interest on this loan. On the other hand, it's a minus, because if the person who owes you this money goes bankrupt, you're out. So a greedy bank, we look at the greedy banks only from the standpoint of they want the interest. We're forgetting that there's this other side to it, which is a greedy bank might want the interest, but it also does not want to be holding a mortgage in which the guy goes bankrupt because the bank loses its money. So those dual forces of desire for interest and desire to avoid a bad loan cause the banks to loan prudently. What happened with the housing crisis is the government intervened and it said, okay, banks, we, the government, are going to take these loans, which are both interest and risk, and we're going to split them into two parts. The interest, you banks get to keep. The risk, we, the government, will take and put on the backs of taxpayers via what you might know as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So effectively what the government's doing is saying the taxpayers are now responsible for these loans if they go bankrupt. Bankers did what you would expect them to do. They looked at this thing which used to be a plus and a minus. If I do this mortgage, I get the interest, but I also incur the risk of it. And we took away the minus. So of course what are the banks going to do? They're going to loan to everybody and anybody because the government took away the negative. That market failure, in my opinion, was due to government intervention. The right thing to do to avoid that market failure is leave the market alone.
Anthony, what is a sunk cost?
A sunk cost is a cost that you have incurred in which your current decision, whatever decision you're facing, has no impact on the cost. Let me give you an example. So I drove down here from Pittsburgh to do these videos. And let's say it cost me, whatever, $50 in gas. And I'm thinking about going home. And should I drive home or should I leave my car here and fly? And maybe pick up my car later. Well, in thinking about should I leave my car here or should I fly, the costs I should be looking at are on the one hand the cost of an airline ticket versus the other, X hours in the car plus gas. Oh yeah, and I got to figure out how to get my car back if I do fly. That's what I should be looking at. What I shouldn't be looking at is that it cost me $50 to drive here. That's a sunk cost. Why should I not be looking at it? Because it doesn't matter. It applies to both instances. If I fly home, it costs me $50 to drive here. If I drive home, it costs me $50 to drive here. The $50 it costs me to drive here is completely irrelevant to the choice that I'm facing. Frequently, people, that sounds kind of simple maybe in that example, but often people will make the mistake of thinking that sunk costs are relevant to a choice they're about to make, when in fact they aren't. And if you can get sunk costs out of the choice you're about to make, it greatly clarifies your thinking.